In what ways do you want to be great? Right? How are you trying to do that? There's a lot of things in life I think we want to be great at. I want to be obviously a great pastor. I want to be a great person of ministry. I want to be a great Christian. I want to be a great husband. I want to be a great father. In the workplace, you want to be a great salesperson or a great boss or a great employee. All kind of things in life that we oftentimes want to be great at or be known as being great. But we have to look at how we're trying to do that. What methods are we using to try to achieve what we consider to be greatness? And I think a lot of this boils down to most of us want to make a difference in life. I think that's kind of a common thread for most people. We want to make some kind of difference in this world. But here's the thing, God's definition of greatness is really a lot different from the world's definition of greatness if we really are honest about it. And as we read through an account today in the Gospel of John, chapter 13, as we look at another key moment in Jesus' ministry, I want us to take note of Jesus' actions as well as his attitudes and how he saw the people who were directly around him. We're going to read this morning, in like I said, in the Gospel of John, chapter 13. So if you got a Bible, you can get that out or open it up on your app. This is the account of Jesus washing the feet of his disciples. And we're going to begin reading in verse 2 of chapter 13. It says here, "Now by the time of supper, the devil had already put into the heart of Judas, Simon Iscariot's son, to betray him. Jesus knew that the Father had given everything into his hands, that he had come from God, and that he was going back to God. So he got up from supper, laid aside his robe, took a towel, and tied it around himself. Next he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, and to dry them with the towel that was around him. He came to Simon Peter, who asked him, 'Lord, are you going to wash my feet?' Jesus answered him, 'What I am doing you don't understand now, but afterward you will know.' 'You will never wash my feet, ever,' Peter said. Jesus replied, 'If I don't wash you, you have no part with me.' Simon Peter said to him, 'Lord, not only my feet, but also my hands and my head.' 'One who is bathed,' Jesus told him, 'doesn't need to wash anything except his feet, but he is completely clean. You are clean, but not all of you.' For he knew who would betray him. This is why he said, 'You are not all clean.' Then going on in verse 12, it says, 'When Jesus had washed their feet and put on his robe, he reclined again and said to them, "Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord. This is well said, for I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do just as I have done for you. I assure you, a slave is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him. If you know these things, you are blessed if you do them." Now that's a fairly familiar, I think, account in the New Testament of Jesus doing that. But based on what you may already know about this period of history that when John was writing, when Jesus had his ministry here on earth, or even something you might suppose, what are some odd things in this account about what happened? What is surprising to you in this scene of Jesus washing his disciples' feet? You feel free you can mention a few of them below if you'd like to. But here are some things that I find kind of odd, in this account. Number one is that at this meal time that had been prepared, that there wasn't a servant there to wash the feet. You say, well, why should there have been? Well, that was a cultural norm at the time. Granted, the disciples and Jesus were always trying to fly a little under the radar, so, I can understand maybe why they didn't have a servant there. But that was a common practice. When you were the host particularly, it was your house or you were hosting the meal, as your guests would come in, you would have a servant who would wash their feet. That was just a common practice. So if we look at one thing that's kind of odd in this situation is that there wasn't a servant there, to wash anyone's feet for that matter. Another thing is somewhat surprising is as we read that account, none of the other disciples offered to wash each other's feet either, did they? Or they didn't offer to wash Jesus's feet. Maybe they could have looked around and said, "Hey, did somebody forget to reserve the servant to come and wash our feet?" None of them volunteered and said, "Well, I'll do it. I'm here. I'll do it for you." They didn't do that, right? So that was another kind of odd peculiar thing that happened in this account. I guess maybe the oddest thing, or the most surprising thing that happens in this account, is that Jesus does what? He takes on the role of the servant, doesn't he? He takes on that task of a servant, and he washes their feet. I think tied to that, another surprising thing is whose feet does he wash? Well, he washes all of their feet. He washes the feet of Judas, who he knows is going to betray him. He washes the feet of Peter, who we know at some point here soon will deny him. And then he washed the feet of all the other disciples who, as a group, would all flee and run away from Jesus during his episode when he's going to the cross at the time where he really needed them the most. So there's a lot of, kind of surprising things that happen in this account and in this story. With what verse 3 tells us about what Jesus was saying, and all of what Jesus knew about what was happening. If we think about all the power Jesus had, if we know the authority that Jesus had as the Son of God, all that was at his disposal. We might, kind of look at this story and go, well, why didn't Jesus just defeat the devil right there, right? Why didn't he just get rid of Satan's influence right there? Why didn't he do something to Judas, right? He could have overwhelmed Judas with some kind of divine power right there, knowing that he was going to be betraying him later on. Knowing Jesus had the capacity to do all that, instead, what does he do? Well, he washes their feet, including the feet of his betrayer. Now, do you think that the disciples would have gladly washed Jesus' feet if they had either thought about it or if Jesus had asked, said, hey, does somebody want to wash my feet? I really think all the disciples would have gladly washed their master, their teacher, their rabbi, as they often called him. I think any of them would gladly have washed Jesus' feet. But here's the thing. I don't imagine any of them would have purposefully or voluntarily washed each other's feet. That's the job, remember, that was normally reserved for the lowest of the low menial servants. Matter of fact, oftentimes in Jewish culture, they wouldn't even give that job to a Jew who was a servant. They would look for a Gentile, even the lowest of the low, to do this somewhat despicable act of washing feet. So it's not surprising the disciples didn't volunteer to wash each other's feet. At the same time, we read in the other Gospels too, like over in Luke chapter 22, that surrounding all these events here, the feet washing, that the disciples had been having discussions and disputes and arguments about who was the greatest among them. So if in their mind they're trying to figure out, well, which one of us is really the greatest, right, amongst each other, certainly washing each other's feet was not going to be at the forefront of their mind. So it seems the disciples were literally shocked at what Jesus did here, at him volunteering to take on this role of servant and wash their feet. I think some of their shock was partly due to them being shamed. Jesus taking on this role, and they kind of maybe looked around at each other and said, hey, maybe one of us should have done this. Right? So I think part of their shock was just in their shame, maybe even in their guilt of Jesus taking on that role. But also I think it was based on their arguments, that and their thoughts about who's the greatest among us. All of that was put in its place. Here we are arguing about who's the greatest among us, and here is the one who truly is greatest, Jesus, and he is the one who is washing our feet. I think this event just blew the disciples' minds. We also hear, what we see here is Jesus reversing the usual roles. We have his act of humility as a display of love, right? Back in verse 1, we didn't read it. Back in verse 1, he talks about, his love for those, particularly those men who are right there around him. His act of humility is a symbol of a saving cleansing that is about to happen with his death and his burial and his resurrection. And then we also see, as we'll talk about in a moment here, in this act of humility, he is modeling for them and for us Christian behavior. So let's talk a minute about this washing, how it's a symbol of spiritual cleansing. And we see that particularly in verses 8 and 10 that we read. Peter, as he's done in the past, he speaks up. Remember, we talked before about on the Mount of Transfiguration. Who was it that interrupted that amazing event to offer to build tents? It was Peter. Peter doesn't seem to have a problem speaking out. So Peter speaks as he's done in the past, and he says to Jesus, "No, you'll never wash my feet." But you see, this action was not really about the physical washing of feet. Jesus said, "If I don't wash you, you have no part with me." And that's something that is always true if we take it in its symbolic meaning. Unless the Lamb of God, who's Jesus, has taken away a person's sin, has washed that person, then that person can have no part of him, can have no part of Jesus. So what he was saying there was spiritually and theologically very true. I think it's doubtful that Peter or anyone else, well, other than Jesus himself, really grasped that this foot washing, that this cleansing, it was being foreshadowed, and it was pointing toward the humiliation that Jesus would soon come to at the cross. But I think what Peter did understand was enough to sort of crank up his usual unrestrained reaction when Jesus began to explain, if I don't wash you, you have no part of me. And then Peter, in his excitement, I guess, or his, exuberance, says, well, if that's the case, then don't just wash my feet, wash my hands and wash my head too. So what we can see now is that this foot washing, it symbolizes the cleansing that is the result of Jesus's impending work on the cross. And in Peter's excitement, we see in verse 9, that really kind of opens up an opportunity for Jesus to turn this foot washing not only into this symbolic cleansing, but it also brings another point in verse 10, that this initial and this sort of foundational cleansing that Jesus is providing and that he will provide after the cross is a once and for all action. People who have been cleansed by Jesus' atoning work have been cleansed by his work on the cross. While certainly we need to confess any daily sin because none of us are perfect, but those who have been cleansed, that initial cleansing, that foundational cleansing, by coming to faith in Christ, we have a fundamental cleansing that can never be or never need to be repeated. It's where we get that phrase, once saved, always saved. Jesus did not give Peter really much more explanation other than that Peter would understand the significance of this washing sometime in the future. And of course, that again is him pointing toward his impending death on the cross and his resurrection. I think if you read, and you can just make note of this, of 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 5 and 6, I think we see what Peter wrote there in that letter, that he must have finally come to realize that humble service meant obedience to Jesus. That this wasn't just if I need you, Jesus, don't just clean my feet, but wash my whole body. And Jesus is saying, we don't really need to do that. You've already been cleansed. And once you're cleansed, that's enough. Sure, you might have to confess your daily sin and do those kind of things, but that one cleansing is for your whole being. So this really incredible act of humility, where Jesus voluntarily does this menial work of a slave, far more, it's really a parable in action about the sacrifice that he's going to make of his own life. Jesus often taught in parables, and this is really a parable in action that we see him doing, because he's doing this act of the foot washing, and then he's explaining what it really, really meant. He was using this to symbolize his atoning, cleansing death, and he was using this to teach a lesson in humility. So we have the washing, which symbolized the cleansing, but then beginning in verse 12 through the rest of that we read, we kind of have Jesus in his teaching. He's teaching the point that this is an expression of humble service. So, Jesus, after he does the foot washing, he gets up and he puts on his outer garment again and he returns to his seat. And then Jesus asks an incredible question. Do you know what I've done for you? Is what he asked. And then Jesus begins to, because obviously they really don't, Jesus begins to unpack the teaching from what he had just done for them. And the heart of Jesus' lesson here is about humility, and it's about service toward our fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. I think some people today, there's some churches, some believe that foot washing should be an ordinance. It should be an ordinance of the church, like we have baptism, like we have the Lord's Supper. Some believe that Jesus was instituting something that we should all be doing in church. But really, doing that today would be missing Jesus' main point. He was not just in this scene, he didn't say, well, I think I'm going to wash the disciples' feet. I'm going to invent some new clever way that I want people to serve each other from now on. Because he was serving in a very common way. And I think because we're detached from the period, the culture at the time, we look at foot washing as being just something very odd and unusual and very unique. But this was a very common practice in the day. He was serving them in a very common way. You know, I'm trying to think of an equivalent for today. It would be like us opening the door for someone, or, you know, I guess in Baptist terms, it would be us preparing a meal and taking it to somebody if they're sick or they just got out of the hospital. That's a very common thing. We don't think that much about it. He was serving people in a very normal, common way of the period. And it's not something that we do or need to be done in our culture today. Not most of us walk around barefoot. And I don't honestly know anyone who washes their feet before they go into their house, or who has their husband or wife or kids wash their feet when they get home from work. That's just not something. We don't have to do that anymore in our culture. So for us, we ought to think of this foot washing not as an act, a specific act that we're to repeat, but as an example in his point about servant leadership, about humble service. So for us today, then, we think about, from the teaching side of this event, what are some ways that we can have this foot washing attitude, right? What are some things we can do that indicate we understand this idea of humility and service? Well, we could take on a menial task, you know. Maybe it's a task that no one else wants, but we're going to do it because we're willing to serve. It could be accepting a lesser role, not being like the disciples and arguing who's the greatest, but taking a lesser role because it's a role that's needed, and it's a role that maybe you're capable of doing. That you're not doing it for the glamour, you're not doing it for the attention. Often we could display this foot washing attitude by not always insisting to have our things done the way we want them done, right? For not always wanting our privilege, you know, in life, whether it's at church or anywhere else. Obviously, this foot washing attitude can be seen in meeting other people's needs instead of just being solely focused on meeting our own. Another example would be looking for a job no one else was willing to do, and then go there and cheerfully do it. There's so many things like at church that go on that are behind the scenes that no one ever sees. And you know, some people, you know, we don't taunt what we do. We don't advertise what we do. We just do it because it needs to be done, and we don't do it and say, "Hey, look at me, what I did." And I think that's that foot washing attitude. Really, I guess it kind of comes to this: it's focusing on the result rather than who gets credit for it. And I think that is probably the true attitude that Jesus is really trying to get us to here in this humility and this idea of servanthood. Is focus on the results, focus on what needs to be done, and not worry about who gets credit. Boy, that goes against the world today, doesn't it? Against our thoughts for today. So what are some takeaways for us in this symbolic foot washing, but also Jesus' teaching about humility? Well, number one, we know we're loved because Jesus humbled himself to serve us and to die for us. Jesus didn't wash our feet, but he did something even greater. He gave his very life for us so that we could have forgiveness of sins and we could have eternal life. What do you think would have been going through your mind if you were one of Jesus' disciples on that occasion? I think we need to think about what goes through our mind when we think about Jesus on that cross and when we think about Jesus' death. What goes through our mind? Is it gratitude? Is it a sense of knowing that he loved us and that he humbled himself, that God humbled himself, number one, to take on flesh, but number two, to give his life on our behalf? A second thing, I think, a takeaway for us is that as we follow Jesus, you know, as we strive to follow him, to be a disciple, we should always be ready to humble ourselves and to serve other people. You know, serving requires humility. You know, I think that's just a trait that comes with it because often our natural inclination, our natural desire is to be served, isn't it? That's our human nature. That's our flesh. We want to be served usually before we want to serve others. So we have to humble ourselves. We have to put on our wrap our towel around our waist and get that basin of water and be willing to symbolically, right, wash the feet of others, to serve other people. I'd like to urge, and encourage you, and if you're part of a Connect group, and I'm going to be talking about this with my Connect group as well. Think about maybe even your family, but think about how you can pray and think on an opportunity. Maybe do it together as a Connect group. Maybe, but to think about a person, or think about a group of people, whatever it might be, that could use some help. And I'm not talking about just taking up money and throwing some money at the problem or the situation, but think of a group, or think of somebody that who could use some help, who could use some love, and to pray and think about how you and some friends, or you and your family, how you could serve them, not to be noticed, but to do it because you want to follow the example of Jesus as a humble servant. Well, I hope you guys have a great day, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch this. As always, if there's something we can pray with you about, we'd love to know that, and you can let us know online, or email, or text, or call. And leave a comment below if you get any questions, or if there's anything particular about this account today that surprised you the most, or maybe encouraged you the most. We'll see you when we see you. Bye.